Thanks for being with us here on BBC News. I'm Laxmi Gopal. We're taking you through the developments of the breaking news that airstrikes have been carried out on the Venezuelan capital, Caracas, with the BBC's US partner, CBS News, saying that it has heard from US officials that the President Donald Trump ordered those strikes to be carried out. Well, let's return to the International Crisis Group's senior analyst in Venezuela, Phil Gunson.
Well, they are obviously, rejecting this and complaining in the strongest possible terms, saying that this is all to do with oil and strategic minerals, that it's an attempt by US imperialism, as they would put it.
Hey everyone, Dr. John is here. This is what just happened. Trump ordered military strikes against Venezuela without notifying a single member of Congress. No authorization request, no debate, no warning, just bombs falling on one man's decision. The reaction on Capitol Hill wasn't just anger. Senior Democratic leaders used the word impeachable not as a soundbite, but as a specific constitutional characterization.
The U.S. is preparing for possible military action inside Venezuela. CBS News has learned senior military officials presented President Trump with potential operations, including land strikes. This comes after months of attacks on alleged drug boats we've been reporting. The latest strike was on Monday. The Pentagon official says it targeted a vessel in the Caribbean and killed 4 people. CBS News correspondent Natalie Brand joins us now from the White House to kick off our coverage today. Good morning, Natalie.
Good morning to you, Errol. Well, 2 sources tell CBS News that no final decision has yet been made, but these sources say that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other senior military officials.
The alarm system built into the Constitution is screaming. Let me start with what actually happened on the record. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries accused Trump of starting the year with chaos, crisis, and corruption. He specifically called the Venezuela action unauthorized military action. Those are his exact words from the official record. Multiple Democrats branded it an impeachable matter. War powers resolutions were pushed to rein in executive military authority. Time magazine, Axios, and multiple other outlets documented the congressional fury in specific and real terms. This goes well beyond the normal partisan back and forth that characterizes most congressional reactions to administration decisions. When the House Minority Leader is using language like unauthorized and impeachable, you need to understand that those words have specific constitutional meanings. They are not rhetorical flourishes. They are legal characterizations with real consequences. Now let me give you the constitutional framework that makes all of this matter. Under the War Powers Resolution of 1973, the President has authority to deploy military forces into hostilities for a limited period. But here's the catch. He must notify Congress within 48 hours, and he must obtain congressional authorization for any military engagement that extends beyond 60 days. The constitutional basis for military action is a combination of the President's Commander-in-Chief authority under Article 2 and Congress's War Powers Authority under Article 1, which gives Congress the exclusive power to declare war. That tension between the 2 articles has been a source of ongoing constitutional debate for decades. But the specific congressional reaction to the Venezuela action reflected a judgment by senior lawmakers that this action went beyond even the most generous interpretation of executive military authority. They concluded it crossed into territory that constituted an unauthorized use of military force requiring a specific congressional response. Think about what that means. When the House Minority Leader calls it unauthorized military action and multiple senior lawmakers put the word impeachable on the record, that is not normal partisan friction. That is the constitutional alarm system activating in response to specific conduct that specific lawmakers believe crosses specific constitutional lines. The War Powers Resolution was passed in the aftermath of Vietnam precisely because Congress concluded that the executive branch had been using military force in ways that went beyond any legitimate constitutional authorization. The legislative branch needed to reassert its constitutional role in decisions about when and how American military force gets used. The Venezuela situation is activating exactly the constitutional tension that the War Powers Resolution was designed to manage. And the congressional reaction is the constitutional mechanism working as it was designed to work. The War Powers dimension connects directly to the broader pattern of constitutional confrontation that has been the defining feature of the second term across multiple different policy areas and multiple different constitutional principles. The specific constitutional question raised by the Venezuela action is whether the president has authority to order military strikes against a foreign nation without congressional authorization and without a clear imminent threat to the United States that would justify emergency executive military action. Legal scholars across the political spectrum have said the War Powers Resolution was specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral executive military action. The congressional reaction reflects a legitimate and constitutionally grounded objection to executive overreach of exactly the kind the War Powers Resolution was enacted to constrain. Now let me talk about Trump's documented pattern of responding to congressional pushback and institutional challenges. He doubles down. He characterizes his opponents as corrupt traitors and witch hunters. This is the behavioral dimension of the refuses to step down story, and it is worth understanding carefully because it tells you something specific about the dynamic that the constitutional confrontation produces. Trump does not de-escalate institutional confrontations. He escalates them. He turns congressional pushback into base mobilization fuel. He characterizes every institutional challenge to his authority as illegitimate political persecution, and he explicitly dares his opponents to try to remove him, framing any attempt to use the constitutional mechanisms of accountability as itself an attack on democracy rather than a defense of it. This pattern is not accidental. It is not purely emotional. It is a specific political strategy built on the calculation that escalation and defiance generate more political energy from his base than any accommodation or compromise would produce. And that calculation creates a specific and serious problem for the constitutional order. It means the normal mechanisms of institutional pressure that are designed to produce adjustments in executive conduct are being systematically converted into political fuel rather than functioning as genuine checks on executive overreach. That is the constitutional crisis in its most specific and most practical form. The mechanisms designed to check executive power are being weaponized as political assets rather than functioning as constitutional constraints. The Jeffries framing of chaos, crisis, and corruption is worth spending specific time on because it represents the most senior Democratic House leadership going on the record with a comprehensive and specific characterization of the second term. This goes beyond individual policy disagreements into territory that frames the entire pattern of conduct as a fundamental challenge to constitutional governance. Jeffries is not a backbench firebrand looking for attention. He is the House Minority Leader, the most senior House Democrat. When he uses language like that to characterize the start of the year, he is making a specific and deliberate institutional statement about the character and severity of the constitutional challenge that the current administration represents. The specific connection he draws between the Venezuela action and the broader pattern of chaos, crisis, and corruption is exactly the kind of comprehensive framing that builds the case for the most serious constitutional response mechanisms rather than just calling for accountability on any individual issue. That framing tells you that the most senior Democratic congressional leadership has concluded that the situation requires comprehensive institutional response rather than piecemeal reaction to individual provocations. Let me dig into the three specific dimensions of this story that each deserve careful treatment. First, the constitutional framework around war powers and why the Venezuela situation activates those questions in genuinely significant ways. Second, the documented pattern of congressional reactions to second-term conduct and what that pattern tells us about the trajectory of accountability pressure. Third, the specific constitutional mechanisms available to Congress and what the current landscape suggests about which of those mechanisms might be activated. Start with the constitutional war powers framework. The Constitution divides war powers between the legislative and executive branches in a specific and deliberate way that reflects the founders' deep concern about giving any single person unilateral authority to commit the nation to military conflict. Article 1 gives Congress the exclusive power to declare war. Article 2 makes the President the Commander-in-Chief. Those two provisions have always been in tension, and the history of American constitutional law is largely the history of managing that tension in specific situations. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was Congress's most specific and most direct attempt to define the boundary between legitimate executive military authority and unauthorized military action that requires congressional authorization. Under the resolution, the president can deploy military forces into hostilities without prior congressional authorization in emergency situations, but must notify Congress within 48 hours and obtain authorization for any engagement extending beyond 60 days. The resolution was designed to prevent exactly the kind of open-ended, unilateral executive military commitment that Vietnam represented. The Venezuela action, involving military strikes against a foreign nation without any clear imminent threat to the United States and without any prior congressional notification or authorization, is precisely the kind of conduct the resolution was enacted to prevent. The congressional reaction is not just partisan politics. It is the constitutional mechanism the War Powers Resolution created, functioning in response to exactly the kind of executive military action it was designed to constrain. The impeachable matter characterization that multiple senior Democrats have applied to the Venezuela action is worth examining in this constitutional logic because it connects the war powers violation to the broader impeachment framework. For an executive action to constitute an impeachable offense, it must represent the kind of high crime or misdemeanor that the constitutional impeachment framework was designed to address. Constitutional scholars have consistently held that unauthorized use of military force in ways that flagrantly violate the constitutional war powers division represents exactly that kind of high crime and misdemeanor. It goes to the fundamental constitutional structure of how military power is supposed to be controlled and accountable in a constitutional democracy. A president who orders military strikes against a foreign nation without congressional authorization and without clear constitutional justification for emergency executive action is not just exceeding the specific provisions of the War Powers Resolution. He is violating the fundamental constitutional principle that military force cannot be committed without the participation of the legislative branch. The impeachable matter characterization is not rhetorical excess. It is the specific and constitutionally grounded judgment of senior lawmakers that the Venezuela action crossed the constitutional line, separating legitimate executive military authority from impeachable abuse of war powers. Now let me talk about the documented pattern of congressional reactions to second-term conduct more broadly. The Venezuela reaction does not exist in isolation. It exists within a pattern of congressional responses to a series of executive actions that have been progressively pushing against the boundaries of constitutional executive authority, immigration enforcement actions that courts have found unlawful, executive orders that judicial review has blocked as unconstitutional overreach, defiance of congressional oversight requests and subpoenas, attacks on the independence of the judiciary. Each of those situations has generated its own specific congressional reaction, and each reaction has added to an accumulating record of responses that individually might be dismissed as partisan politics, but that collectively reveal a pattern of congressional alarm about the systematic character of the constitutional challenges the current administration is presenting. When you look at the Venezuela reaction in the context of that broader pattern, the specific language being used, unauthorized military action, impeachable matter, war powers resolution invocation, is not a fresh escalation. It is the continuation and intensification of a pattern that has been building across the entire second term. It is now reaching the point where the most senior congressional leaders are using the most serious constitutional language available to characterize what they are seeing. The War Powers Resolution invocation is the specific legislative mechanism that the congressional reaction is likely to activate most immediately and most concretely. It represents Congress using one of its most direct and most specifically targeted tools for constraining executive military authority. The War Powers Resolution gives Congress the specific authority to pass a concurrent resolution directing the President to remove United States armed forces from hostilities if they have been introduced without a declaration of war or specific statutory authorization. This concurrent resolution mechanism does not require the president's signature and cannot be vetoed. It is the legislative branch using its constitutional authority to directly constrain executive military action in real time. The invocation of that mechanism in response to the Venezuela action would represent Congress asserting its constitutional war powers authority in the most direct and most immediately consequential way available to it short of the impeachment process itself. The mechanism is real. It has real teeth. And the congressional reaction is the specific kind of reaction that activates that mechanism in ways that create real and immediate legal and constitutional consequences for the executive branch. The refuses to step down dynamic and what it means for the constitutional confrontation is worth analyzing carefully because it reveals the specific strategic logic of the Trump approach to institutional challenges. The explicit public refusal to step down and the dare to Congress to try to remove him is not just defiance for its own sake. It is a specific political strategy designed to convert the constitutional accountability confrontation into a base mobilization event by framing any attempt to use the constitutional removal mechanisms as an illegitimate political attack by corrupt traitors and witch hunters. The strategy transforms the constitutional mechanisms themselves into partisan political weapons in the eyes of enough of the public that the political cost of actually deploying those mechanisms increases dramatically for the lawmakers who would have to deploy them. That is the specific constitutional problem that the refuses to step down strategy is designed to create. It makes the constitutional mechanisms more politically costly to use than the conduct they are designed to address. In that dynamic, the weaponization of constitutional accountability mechanisms as political fuel is the most specifically alarming feature of the current constitutional confrontation because it attacks the foundational premise of the constitutional framework itself. The historical parallel to Nixon is instructive. Nixon's strategy of calling Watergate a witch hunt and characterizing his opponents as politically motivated ultimately failed because the documentary evidence was specific enough and clear enough, and the institutional resolve of enough Republicans was sufficient to overcome the political cost of using the constitutional mechanisms. The question for the current moment is whether the same combination of specific documentary evidence and sufficient institutional resolve is present in the current political environment. Let me bring this all the way home with 4 clear points. Point 1. The Venezuela action and the congressional characterization of it as unauthorized military action and an impeachable matter represents a genuinely significant constitutional moment that goes beyond normal partisan conflict. It activates the specific constitutional framework around war powers that the founders and the Congress of 1973 specifically designed to prevent unilateral executive military commitments without legislative participation. The War Powers Resolution exists for a specific constitutional reason. The founders designed the War Powers Division between Article 1 and Article 2 specifically because they understood from historical experience what happens when a single person has unilateral authority to commit a nation to military conflict. The congressional reaction is the constitutional mechanism functioning as designed. When senior Democratic leadership calls it unauthorized military action and multiple senior lawmakers put impeachable on the record, that is not partisan noise. That is the constitutional alarm system activating. Point 2. The specific legislative mechanisms available to Congress are real and robust. The War Powers Concurrent Resolution Mechanism does not require a presidential signature and cannot be vetoed. It represents the most direct and most immediately consequential tool available to Congress, short of impeachment itself. The War Powers Resolution gives Congress authority to direct the removal of military forces from hostilities through a concurrent resolution that bypasses the presidential veto. That mechanism is the legislative branch's most specific and most direct tool for constraining executive military authority in real time. Invocation of that mechanism in response to the Venezuela action would represent Congress asserting its constitutional war powers authority in the most direct way available. It would create real and immediate legal and constitutional consequences for the executive branch, regardless of whether the president chose to comply. Point 3. The refuses to step down dynamic represents the most specifically alarming feature of the current constitutional confrontation. It converts constitutional accountability mechanisms into political fuel in ways that increase the political cost of deploying those mechanisms and attack the foundational premise of the constitutional framework. By framing every attempt to use constitutional removal mechanisms as illegitimate political persecution, this strategy makes those mechanisms more politically costly for lawmakers to deploy than the underlying conduct they are designed to address. This attacks the constitutional framework at its most fundamental level by making the mechanisms of constitutional accountability less effective precisely when the conduct they are designed to address is most serious. The central question is whether specific documentary evidence and sufficient institutional resolve can overcome the weaponization of accountability mechanisms as political fuel. Point 4. Here is exactly what we need to watch going forward. Watch the war powers resolution activity in both chambers for any indication that the concurrent resolution mechanism is being formally invoked. Formal invocation would represent the most direct and consequential near-term constitutional response available to Congress. Watch the specific vote counts on any war powers or accountability measures that come to the floor for any indication that bipartisan support necessary to make those measures effective is developing beyond the Democratic base into Republican ranks, where decisive votes will have to come from. Watch Trump's specific public response to any formal congressional accountability actions for the specific pattern of escalation and base mobilization that characterizes his approach to institutional challenges. That response will tell you how threatening he judges specific actions to be. Watch the broader congressional leadership dynamics for any indication that Republican leaders are privately recalculating the sustainability of continued public support for specific conduct in light of the constitutional characterizations being used by senior Democratic leadership and legal scholars. The Venezuela action and the documented congressional reaction represent a genuinely significant constitutional moment that activates the specific war powers framework in response to specific conduct that senior lawmakers have characterized as unauthorized military action and an impeachable matter on the record. The War Powers Resolution concurrent resolution mechanism is real and robust and represents the most direct and immediately consequential congressional tool for constraining executive military authority short of impeachment. The refuses to step down dynamic converts constitutional accountability mechanisms into political fuel in ways that attack the foundational premise of the constitutional framework and make accountability more difficult precisely when the conduct at issue is most serious. The broader pattern of second-term constitutional confrontations across multiple policy areas is building an accumulating record of congressional alarm that the Venezuela reaction represents the latest and most serious installment. This is the most fundamental constitutional confrontation of the second term. The branch that controls war powers and impeachment authority is going on record calling specific executive conduct unauthorized and impeachable. The executive branch is responding by daring Congress to try to do something about it. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Does Congress actually deploy the constitutional mechanisms, or does the political cost prove too high even when the constitutional violations are this specific and this documented?